What is identified assets? If you have received a contract of multiple assets, will it be accounted as a separate lease component or a single lease component? And how would you allocate the total consideration for lease between lease component and non-lease component? If you would like to know the answer, please follow this episode. In our last episode, we understood that for any lease assessment, there should be an identified assets. In most of the cases, identified assets explicitly mentioned in the contract. However, in some cases, you will see that assets is implicitly mentioned in the contract. It means assets will be specified or identified when it will be available for use to the customer. Let's see in an example. For example, lessee entered into a 10 years of lease contract for a crane. And in lease contract, it mentioned what will be the brand of crane, what's the model number, and what's the color. And at inception date, and this crane is not yet built. In this case, because the assets is implicitly mentioned in the contract, but it will be an identified assets. You know why? Because the assets is identifiable on the commencement of the lease when assets will be physically available for use of the customer. Capacity portion of assets is identified assets if it can be physically distinct. For example, if lessee is getting a lease for X floor of the building, sorry for my drawing, and you have, for example, there are 3 floors in the building, and in lease contract it mentioned that lessee is getting lease for the 2nd floor of the building, then it's a physically distinct, so it's a lease contract. In another example, if we see there is a warehouse and you are getting lease for X particular area of that warehouse, then it's a lease contract and there is an identified assets. There are some cases where assets is not physically distinct, and in that case it will not be lease. For example, if lessee is getting a lease for capacity portion of fiber optic cable or a capacity portion of data storage cloud, then it will not be an identified assets and there won't be any lease. However, even though the capacity portion of the assets is not physically distinct, still there can be an identified assets and it will qualify for lease. The exception is that if the customer has a right on substantially all the capacity of the assets, then there can be an identified assets. Let's understand better in an example. For example, a customer got a right to use the oil pipeline and he got 90% capacity right on the use of oil pipeline. So in this case, customer has right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits coming from the oil pipeline, although it's not a physically distinct, but it will be qualified for identified assets and it will be a lease for the pipeline. And in the same example, if it is not for 90%, if customer got right for 50%, then there is no identified assets because customer is not getting substantially all the economic benefits of the pipeline. Hope it's clear. And if customer is getting perpetual right for use of any assets, then it will be outside the scope of IFRS 16 because there is no specified period of time, there is no lease term, so it will not qualify for accounting under IFRS 16. Let's understand how to account right of use of underlying assets either as a separate lease component or a single lease component. You can account it as a separate lease component if both the conditions are met. The first one, that the underlying asset can be used separately or its own. And the second condition is that the assets is not dependent or not interrelated on the use of other assets. So if one or both the conditions are not met, then the right to use of multiple assets will be accounted as a single lease component. Let's understand this in a better with example. For example, lessee entered into a 5 years of contract for a crane along with other accessories and spare parts. So crane and spare parts will be recorded as a single lease components. You know why? Because the spare parts cannot be used separately or on its own. And also the use of crane is dependent on the uses of spare parts. Let's see another example where lessee entered into a contract for crane as well as loading truck. So in this case, lessee will be recording both the assets as a separate lease components because loading truck can be deployed by lessee separately and they can benefit from use of it. If a lease contract includes maintenance fees, supplies of utilities, service cost, all these are part of non-lease components and they will be recorded or accounted in accordance with guideline given in other accounting standard. However, the good news is that the lessee can elect practical expedient given in the standard where all the non-lease components can be recorded as a lease components combined and accounted as a one line item. And you must have seen there are some other charges also mentioned in lease contract such as admin fee, insurance, taxes, property taxes, etc. First of all, these payments are not for any goods or service. So they will not be part of a lease component or a non-lease component. And they will be part of total consideration paid for the lease contract. So you need to allocate all the other charges for standalone price of lease component and aggregated standalone price of non-lease components. Let's understand in a better in Excel example. In this example, lessee has entered into 3 years of lease contract for both car and truck, which also includes a service contract from lessee. So the lease term is 3 years. The consideration total is $120,000, which also includes admin charges of $10,000, and the annual installment is $40,000. And now we need to calculate what is the relative standalone price of the car. For illustrative purpose, I have given here $50,000. And the observable standalone price of truck is $100,000 and the aggregated standalone price of the service contract is $50,000. So that means we have 25% for car, 50% for truck and 25% for the service contract. And I have given two scenarios where lessee does not elect the practical expedient given in the standard. That means lessee will be recording lease component separately and non-lease component separately. And in lease component, it will be accounted as a two separate lease component, one for car and another one for truck. So here, as we understood that 120,000 is the total consideration, out of which 10,000 for admin expenses. So you can see 110,000 for car and truck, okay, which also includes a service contract. And it is allocated based on 25%, 50% and 25% ratio. Hope it's clear. And then admin charges has also been allocated here based on the relative percentage. Okay. So the total consideration here is 30,000 for the car, which will be accounted as a separate lease component. We will have right of use assets and lease liability separately for car. Similarly, 60,000 for the truck. And the service contract will be recorded in line with other accounting standard and it will be recorded in the income statement of the lessee. Let's see if lessee elect the practical expedient, means it will not be recorded as a non-lease component. So there won't be any non-lease component. Everything will be recorded as a lease component where car will have value of 30,000, which we have seen from our previous scenario, and 60,000 for the truck, and the non-lease component for the service contract will be allocated between car and truck based on the relative percentage. So in this example, you can see we have higher value for right of use assets and lease liability for car, which is 40,000 and 80,000 for the truck. And please also remember that if lessee elect the practical expedient, then they should mention in the accounting policy, and it should be applied consistently.